Once again, a very good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this side event on measuring adaptation results organized by the GCF. I hope that all of you are having a very productive COP27, and thank you for joining us at this event. So this is, okay. So this is going to be technical event, but at the same time, it's also going to be an event that will that is addressed to a wider audience, where we are going to discuss both the technical topic of measuring adaptation results and also hear from our panelists the experiences that they have in GCF projects and other projects in measuring adaptation results. Now, why are we talking about adaptation results, and is this okay? And why is this an important topic? Uh, well, as you know, for mitigation, we have been working for more than 20 years now, and we have developed a lot of methodologies to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So mitigation is an area where we have a lot of clarity on how to measure impact. However, when it comes down to adaptation, which is context specific, uh, we are not there yet. There are a lot of approaches that have been tested globally. There is also a mandate from the COP and a work stream on measuring adaptation results, but we still do not have a unified framework on how to do that. So today, I'm joined by a group of panelists who will share their experiences. And I want to introduce them first before we start with this event. So to my left is Safira Patel, and she's from DBSA. She's the head of Environment and Social Governance. Well, and next to her is Rebecca Mincy. So Rebecca is an investment director at the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund. Next to him is Dr. Sadiq from PKSF in Bangladesh. He's a deputy managing director for climate change and environment. And next to Dr. Sadiq, we have Li Fang Li from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. He is a director of the Land and Water Division. And finally, but not least importantly, we are also joined by Laila Daroich, who is a climate policy consultant with Perspectives Climate Group. So today we'll start our discussions by a short overview of what actually the GCF does in relation to adaptation result management. I'll talk about this for about 5 minutes. And after that, I'll give in order the floor to our panelists to share their experiences. At the end, Laila will provide us with an overview of the work that actually Perspectives Climate Group is doing for the GCF and this innovative approach that they're suggesting in relation to measuring adaptation results. We'll have a panel discussion after that and also open the floor for questions from the audience. So without any further ado, I would like to start with the first presentation today, and I would like to ask my technical colleague to show the first presentation on the screen. Thank you. So, okay, perfect. Great. Let me test whether this works. So let's have a look first of all at the GCF adaptation portfolio. As you know, the GCF has a mandate to invest 50% of its resources into adaptation projects. And this is what our adaptation portfolio looks at the moment. We have committed 6.4 billion US dollars in adaptation projects as GCF funding, and we have also managed to mobilize in terms of co-financing $13.5 billion. So our total financing contribution to adaptation terms of approved projects, both adaptation and cross-cutting projects, is close to 20 billion US dollars. So we do a significant work in the field of adaptation. Now, if you look at the adaptation portfolio in its regional distribution, the largest part of projects are in Africa, 37%, followed by Asia Pacific, 34%, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And if you look at the adaptation portfolio, in terms of LDCs, seeds, and African states, 61% has been invested there. And this is in line also with the mandate that we have from the board, that we have to invest more than 50% of our adaptation funds into LDCs, seeds, and African states. So we are fully aligned with that, and we are supporting those most vulnerable countries with adaptation activities. And what is the impact of that portfolio? So we saw that $20 billion have been invested in adaptation projects. So in terms of beneficiaries, based on what we have as targets in our funding proposals, we have 226 million direct beneficiaries that will be reached by our projects, and approximately 450 million indirect beneficiaries globally. So we're reaching quite a large size of the population of the countries where we are investing. Now, how do we measure adaptation results? Let's look at that after we have seen the numbers in the GCF portfolio. And this slide shows what is our result architecture. For those of you who are following closely the work of the GCF, you're probably aware that we have adopted the new integrated result management framework, and the result architecture is displayed on the screen now. But we are looking at measuring both adaptation and mitigation results of the projects that the GCF has, as well as how we contribute to enabling environment. And in the case of adaptation, under the new result management framework, we want to ensure that there are very clear pathways, logical pathways established that link beneficiaries of adaptation activities to particular climate vulnerabilities, and how exactly those beneficiaries adapt to them or how they improve their resilience. So in our result management framework, and these are the indicators that we have first of all one core indicator that we have been using for the past 7 years, both in the previous result management framework and now, and this is direct and indirect beneficiaries that have been reached. And we also have a core indicator which measures the value of physical assets made more resilient. And this was a new element that we introduced in our result management framework, because in adaptation, in addition to measuring how many beneficiaries you have reached, you also have to see how you have contributed to the resilience of physical assets, and also to resilience of economic assets. And finally, we have another adaptation indicator, which is related to increased resilience of natural resource areas. And this is hectares natural resource areas brought under improved low emission or climate resilient management practices. So as you can see, we are trying through our result management framework to capture some aspects of adaptation in addition to beneficiaries. But at the same time, we are aware that maybe this is not a perfect framework, but this is still a good step compared to what we have been doing originally. And from now on, we'll be working very actively with our accredited entities also to support them in reporting against those indicators, and so that we can measure better adaptation results of our projects. So this is briefly from the side of the GCF, and I hope this could set the scene. So now I want to turn over to our panelists today and also hear what their experiences are and what they can share with us today. So as you can see, we have representatives of direct access entities from the private sector and also from international access entities. So with your permission, I will start with my colleague from DBSA, Safira Patel, who will share the experiences of DBSA in measuring adaptation impact. So Safira, over to you. And can you say?
Hi. Okay. Thank you very much for this opportunity and the invitation to participate on this very informative and important channel. Um, okay. I'm going to do a brief presentation on what the DBSA is doing with respect to climate change and adaptation specifically, and how we're integrating our adaptation work into our just transition framework, as well as our reporting approach. I think I'll start while the presentation is coming up, because so what we've done is we've put together what we call our integrated sustainable development approach. We'll show you the slide shortly. The approach is an approach we've taken that's a bank-wide approach. It speaks to all the various aspects of our just transition and how we aim to facilitate a just transition that is low carbon, resilient, very important, and sustainable and inclusive. So this our framework, which is our integrated sustainable development approach, it covers everything from the strategy that we need to put in place, from our targets that we're still developing, as well as our ESMS system, and more importantly, our development results reporting system. So the development results reporting framework, as you can see over there, our development results reporting framework is what we have more or less based our entire just transition approach from the reporting side on. So if I can just briefly talk to this slide, you can see there at the top, that is the context within which we're operating, and that is how we set our, shall we say, set the context and embed ourselves within the requirements that we need to meet. For example, we have our Paris Agreement, we've got South Africa's NDP, we have TCFD, we have TNFD, as well as the NDCs, as well, and more very importantly, the SDGs. So all of these work together to guide and integrate with our development mandate, which is the DBSA's mandate. And from there, we have our development position. And even though we put in place our development position quite a while ago, before we actually embarked on our just transition, the development position at that stage had already started incorporating issues of the just transition. So if, in a nutshell, our development position talks to a just transition towards a renewed and inclusive economy and society that embodies resilience, regeneration, and transcends current trajectories of development. So you will note here that resilience is a key element of our development position. So if we move on then, we've got our Sustainable Development Finance Strategy, as mentioned earlier. It's got three main elements. The first would be our frameworks, guidelines, tools, and also our templates that we use for due diligence when we do ESG due diligence, and our policies and frameworks. Within that we have our ESMS, we've got our climate change policy, we've got all the various policies we need to put in place. Next to that, we have our sustainable finance practices. So our practices speak to issues of how we're applying our policies and programs, how we're implementing them, and what it actually means for the projects that come into the bank. And then after that, we have our governance and impact reporting. So I think what's really important, and our governance and impact reporting, from the impact perspective, that's where our development results reporting framework comes into play. And our our DRRF, it's from a macro perspective, the aim of our development results reporting framework is to align the bank's mandate with South Africa and international good practice, as well as ensure that we're picking up what we need to pick up with respect to indicators and reporting and various benchmarks, especially from our partner DFIs such as GCF and KFW. Then we have alignment and internal reporting, which is critically important as well. So while we do have to report externally to our partners, we have to have a system that works internally for the DBSA's requirements. What we found is that internal and external reporting requirements tend to be different, and we cannot use the same set of indicators always to do Obviously, there's indicators would be aligned. Some of them are the same, but some of them need to be made specific to the DBSA's requirements. Okay, so our developed results reporting framework, it basically provides a framework for all the impact monitoring for the organization, for the DBSA, and it integrates the monitoring and evaluation processes into the bank's existing systems. It enhances accountability, and it also outlines the manner in which development results and outcomes are measured for the organization. If you look here, so in a nutshell, that's our development results reporting framework. You'll note that if we start from the left, we've got our core sector indicator framework, and that's pretty much our directory. I like to think of it as a directory. And we have input indicators, output indicators, outcome indicators, and it's a combination of sectoral indicators as well as project specific indicators. And this is again very important for us because we do need to measure at a project level, but we also need to know what's going on at a sectoral level as well as what our impact is at that level. From there, and we review it annually because I think the space is moving so quickly at the moment that you can't not look at and make sure that your indicators, your metrics, your taxonomies are properly aligned. We also have our development results template, which is our DRT. So this is the tool that we use to basically it sets the scene for all our reporting. We have our indicators on there, sectoral and project level. We detail them at project preparation stage, so ex ante, and then we use them to do our monitoring. So if you see there, the next column is basically the monitoring report. So our DRT acts as it's not a log frame, it's kind of like a log frame. We had to make it slightly different because, again, we needed to suit internal context and requirements, and we found that log frames weren't very happily or readily accepted amongst our teams. So it's kind of a log frame, but it's not. From there, we have our monitoring report. So all the indicators we put onto our DRT are used in the monitoring report, and then all of those indicators are then used for our project completion report. So it's a seamless process with the indicators to the DRT, which you use across, and then ultimately we have what we call our evaluations and output assessments, and all of that information, we will start with gathering what we've gathered internally, and then we're evaluated independently. We also have our development results working group, and this specifically I think is critically important. So when we started our DRT and our development results reporting framework, what we found is even though we had a lot of capacity building within the organization and knowledge share to try and get our investment teams familiarized with it, familiarized with the need for indicators, why you need to identify them up front, and ensure that we're looking at the right indicators at the beginning of the project due diligence process prior to our investment process and decision making. It was a bit of a fight. There were quite a few challenges there. And what made it worse is that data availability for monitoring is often, within our context, not available. So you can have the best systems and tools. If we don't have data, I think everybody here understands, you've got nothing. So gathering the data was critically important, and we were unable to do that effectively enough within certain parts of our portfolio, especially the municipal space. And the reason I mention that is within the mitigation and private sector projects, it's a lot easier to go, right, here are the gigawatts of renewable energy produced or emissions reduced. However, when you're looking at certain adaptation indicators and resilience indicators, it's less easy. It's a bit more difficult to get that sort of a data at the right time as well. And a lot of our work being in the municipal space, a lot of our municipal funding is balance sheet funding. So you don't always have the line of sight to the actual project. And one of the other problems with that is if we are able to have access to the projects and know what projects are being funded within the municipal space, that's where a great deal of our resilience work and our adaptation work can actually happen, because you're dealing with communities, you're dealing with infrastructure that needs to become more resilient, that needs to be designed in a more resilient manner, that needs to enable the adaptation that we need. So that is one of our big problems, is how do we get undercapacitated municipalities to be able to provide us with the specific information we need to facilitate reporting on adaptation. That's, I think, is one of our biggest challenge. So what we then did is we put together a development results working group, and the working group is chaired, well, by myself at the moment, but from various heads across the organization, and we make sure that all projects and the DRTs for all projects, prior to being submitted to the investment committee, they come to the working group. And that's where we set the requirements, that's where we discuss and debate the indicators. And also often it acts as a place where we can interact with our investment teams and say, well, you know what, this project can actually go, if you change your objectives, if you rewrite it, if you highlight certain elements, it could become an adaptation project. Because usually it would just be a stormwater and drainage project in a municipal space. But if you reposition it, if you look at it in a different way, you can actually turn it into an adaptation project. So that we found particularly important, and that's been helping us a lot. Lastly, and an example of how this, speaking about projects at the early stage with the investment teams, capacitating them and helping them understand the need for these indicators, and the need to start integrating and looking at our projects differently. Instead of just providing our infrastructure, we need resilient infrastructure. And if you start picking at the front and start providing guidance at the project development, project prep phase, you can then facilitate the move towards moving all our infrastructure, hopefully, towards that would facilitate adaptation and make our infrastructure and our cities more resilient. I'll give you one quick example. So recently, we've had a great deal of flooding in the KZN province, in the eThekwini municipality. I'm not sure if you guys may have seen some of the projects, the impacts, the visuals of what happened, and it wasn't particularly nice. What's happened subsequent to that is, because of the failing infrastructure, the catchment has become very polluted, because you've got wastewater treatment works which are no longer able to work. You've got entire catchments and rivers that cannot be used. I mean, the last time I checked, the E. coli count was really not doubled or tripled. It was way beyond doubled or tripled. But what was important in this project is, and we didn't notice it when we put the project together, but it came out afterwards, after, unfortunately, the floods, was that the project included what we called our eco-champs. So we had a group of women so that was good for our gender elements and speaking to biodiversity, managing the catchment, taking the samples every single day, doing catchment management, alien clearing, and educating the communities along that catchment about why you need to look after your catchment. So the one reason we didn't actually, and I think this is really good, even though the floods were horrible, is we didn't lose any lives, because these were the eco-champs were the same people who lived in that community, which was a very high-risk community, because a lot of it was an informal settlement along the edges of a river. The eco-champs were mobilized to then go and alert the communities to what was coming, and they were able to move out. So my point there is, we often put projects together, which can be adaptation and resilience projects, if we are able to change how we develop our projects and position our projects up front. And that, for me, was really important, because that could clearly be an adaptation project, but it wasn't positioned as an adaptation project. And that's how I think we're undervaluing a lot of the work that we're doing in that sector.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Safira. This was a very interesting presentation, a very rich one, because we could see a well-developed result management framework for a national regional developmental bank, but you're also looking at how you can measure, in addition to developmental impact, also adaptation impact. And I think this is a very good example. And you also underlined some important issues, such as lack of data availability, but also how you can transform a developmental project into an adaptation project. And I think this is very important. I'm just wondering, if you have such a well-developed result management framework, don't you have challenges to address some of the requirements of donor agencies like ours?
We most definitely have challenges. Okay, and one of our challenges is that, because we work with Jeff, we work with GCF, we work with KFW, and everybody has a different requirement for reporting. So what was important for us is that our DRRF is flexible enough and resilient to be able to jump and report according to whatever reporting requirement comes away. So we can do our TCFD reporting from there. When the time comes, we can do our TNFD reporting. We can report to GF and GCF. So it's not that we've adopted one set of indicators, but we've brought all the indicators together in our core sector indicator framework. And that enables us to gather data, keep it safe, and then report as to whichever report needs to come out.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Safira. A very interesting intervention. And I have a lot of other questions to ask you, but I want to move to the next panelist and maybe ask more questions when we move to the Q&A session. And our next panelist is Rebecca Mincy from ARA for Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund. So she will talk about RF and how RF is measuring adaptation results. It's a very interesting intervention because you see a slightly different perspective. We heard about what a development bank can do in terms of result management, but let's hear what the private sector is doing in terms of measuring adaptation impact. So I would ask to show presentation 4.
Hello. Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca. I'm the investment director for the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund. I'll just give you a bit of context about who we are, then I'll jump to the good stuff in terms of how we measure adaptation and climate resilience in the context of an investment fund. So just really quickly, we're a $58 million venture capital fund, and we invest in companies that help smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. We invest in 4 different countries right now: Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and Ghana. We are sponsored by Acumen and anchored by the Green Climate Fund with First Loss Capital. And typically when we invest in companies, we are taking equity stake. Our typical ticket size is somewhere between $1.5 and $3 million. And we, so far, since we launched in late 2019, early 2021, we've invested in 7 companies. A few of our companies, just to give you a sampling of the types of companies that we look at, include Sun Culture is one. They're a solar irrigation company that sells solar irrigation pumps across East and West Africa. We've also invested in Uzima Chicken, which is a rural poultry company in both East and West Africa as well, that are delivering highly resilient, very sturdy, enhanced breeds of birds to smallholder farmers that increase income and nutrition levels. And another example of a company is like Farmerline, which is an ag tech company in Ghana, and they work through agrovets to provide fertilizers and inputs. They also provide farmer training and market offtake. So those are a few samples of the companies that we've invested in. Just in terms of what has happened from a commercial standpoint as a result of our investment, 4 times more money has come into these companies since we've invested. So we have crowded in that capital. The companies that we've invested in have increased their revenues over 2.5 times since we've invested, and we've seen a 36% growth in the number of employees. So these are all things that we track on a quarterly basis. In addition to, like I said, some of the climate and impacts work that we also report on a quarterly basis. So before we make an investment, we have what's called a resilience screen. Basically, this is a predictive tool that helps us to understand whether or not a company pre-investment is highly, moderately, or low likely to help farmers become more climate resilient. It keeps us from greenwashing investments, to be quite honest with you. And basically, the tool that we use measures the predictive nature of the tool. Measured it across 4 different dimensions. The first one is just kind of a general benefit, understanding the company and where it's located. The second part is really on kind of climate change in the context of like what is happening in the local community where the company plans to operate today and figuratively tomorrow. We use a large set of databases to help us to figure this out, everything from satellite data to historical weather information to help us understand what's actually happening there on the ground. And then we also look at the resilience benefit of the model. Basically, given what the company wants to do they want to provide farmer training? Do they want to provide market access? What exactly is it about the business model that gives us comfort and gives the tool comfort, basically, that this particular company has the right model to help farmers become climate resilient? And then finally, we look at something called negative impact, so unintended consequences. Sometimes the best ideas don't step through the potential impacts 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 7 years from now. And an example of that is sun culture. Basically, sun culture provides solar irrigation pumps. And how that works, very practically speaking, is that farmers have dug wells or boreholes. They submerge the pump in the water, and the pump, through its solar battery, pumps the water up and waters their crops. Well, those wells and those boreholes pull from an aquifer. And so right now the aquifer in Kenya is okay, but we, through as a result of understanding the tool and letting the tool teach us what we should be thinking about, we have required that the company, at a certain interval, work with a third party to measure the aquifer to make sure that our plans to scale for the business, we hope that right now they probably have about 10,000 active pumps. As they scale to 30, 40, 50, 60,000 pumps, we want to make sure that the aquifer is not in any danger as the company scales commercially. And so this tool helps us to understand that. So far, we have only invested in companies that are predicted to have high climate resilience. We have not taken the other companies for approval. In addition to using the screen, we send it back to the creator of the screen. So we worked with WinRock in order to create this predictive tool. So once we fill out the tool and complete it and get a result, we send it back to WinRock, basically to get their stamp of approval that we've used it correctly, that all the explanations are correct, and our investment committee, the approval body that we have to take our investments to, they require this, and would not approve an investment unless WinRock, a third party, has given us that stamp of approval. So that is really a great accountability tool for us as investors, and particularly investors that are focused on climate resilience. Post-investment. Now this is the good stuff. So basically, we have two different dimensions, if you will, of impact and climate resilience that we measure. First of all, we have something called farmer well-being, where we try to understand, are farmers making more money? Are their yields increasing? Are they happy with the company in general? And then we have a set of climate resilience metrics that we also track. And so how do we do it? We basically call farmers on an annual basis. We work with a third party to literally pick up the phone and start to ask them about 76 questions around what's working and what's not. And I'll give you a sample of some of those questions in the next slide. But so far we have an 89% success rate. Last year we spoke to just under 900 smallholder farmers. We expect to talk to probably around 1,500 farmers this year. Usually it's I think it's about 275 farmers per company that we speak to. That gives us a confidence interval of about 95%. So we feel comfortable that the data that is coming back to us really does have some merit. And the surveys are all done in the local language. So we work very closely with our companies to understand what language this particular person is speaking, so that we can make sure that the surveys are translated properly and the interview happens in a language where the surveyor is comfortable. When we are trying to understand farmer well-being, there are about 3 different dimensions that we ask questions about. Some of these are impact focused and some of these are commercial. And by commercial, I mean very business oriented. So poverty profile, just we want to understand what your income level is. There's some strong correlations between income and climate resilience. And so we try to get a baseline for that. First time access and alternatives. What does that mean? Is this the first time you've ever accessed a program like this, a product or service like this? This is one of the things that we measure and are accountable for as we understand what's happening in terms of products and services that are available to farmers. Are there any alternatives available? And what does that mean for the company? It means how big is the competitive landscape? And so this is something that companies have to be very, very careful of as they're developing products and services. Is there a competitor there to the left and to the right that can potentially take market share from them? Moving on to the impact of a company. Changes in income, changes in quality of life, yield, productivity, and changes in the way of farming. We basically ask our farmers whether or not the company is responsible for these increases in income, quality of life, etc. And thankfully, farmers are very honest. They will tell us if there's no change. They will tell us if there's a little bit of change and a lot of change. And so this has really been a great feedback loop for our companies. Early stage businesses, they don't have the money for customer insights and RCTs and things like that. And so this is a really helpful feedback loop to understand what's happening on the ground with their end consumer. And we also basically track a couple more things. We ask for suggestions. We ask for challenges that the companies are having, that the farmers are having with the company. And we track something called Net Promoter Score. If you've ever gone to a restaurant and someone asks you, "Would you recommend this? Would you recommend this restaurant?" That generates a net promoter score. So we basically ask farmers that, and we track whether how the net promoter score changes year over year over year. Net promoter score is a proxy for customer loyalty, and so you would think as an entrepreneur, you would want to know how loyal your customer is going to be. They're the ones who are going to tell more people, about your product and services. So having a really strong net promoter score is an overall indicator of the health of the business for us, and so we do track that. Now, on to the climate resilience impact measurement. So, similarly, we also we call farmers and ask them another 76 questions, roughly, just on climate, and still in their own language. And what we ask them is questions around three different dimensions. The first one is their ability to adapt. Are you using climate smart agronomy practices? What we're really trying to understand, right? Are you using the intercropping? Are you using topsoil cover? Or are you doing soil testing? These are standard metrics and standard criteria that I think any climate expert will tell you should be happening in farming. And so we have taken those kind of best practices, and what we try to understand is each of these kind of four categories. We try to understand it across four dimensions, and you'll see at the bottom. I'm sorry if it's a bit small, but you'll see at the bottom these little dots. The red, yellow, light green, and blue, right? And what these little dots are is that what we're trying to understand is how whether or not a farmer is what we call risky, vulnerable, emerging, or resilient within each of these sections. So what's the difference between a risky farmer and an emerging farmer? Let me tell you. So a risky farmer is a farmer who doesn't know and doesn't do the activity that they're supposed to do to make them more resilient. A vulnerable farmer is a farmer that knows but doesn't do it. There is for emerging farmers, they know but they don't do it consistently. And then for resilient farmers, they know and they do it on a consistent basis. And basically what we ask farmers these, are you doing it? Are you not doing it? What do you know? What you don't know? We ask them these questions across each of the dimensions. So under adaptation, it's mostly climate smart agronomy practices. Under enablers, it's things like, it's stuff. It's things like, do you have access to training? Do you have access to credit? Do you have access to the market? Do you have access to storage? The things that you need in order to become a better farmer. So it's not necessarily a skill-based metric. It really is accessibility, the things that help to create this enabling environment for you to be more resilient farmer. Are they there? Then finally, it's the ability to absorb a shock. And like I said, in this particular case, your ability to absorb a shock is often very closely tied to your income. So what we want to understand is, do you have an emergency savings account? Did you have any early warning systems? Do you have crop insurance? And so farmers answer these questions for us, and there we're able to generate a resilience percentage, basically, for each of the companies in our portfolio. Don't worry about this. This is a repeat of what we've already done. But let me give you an example of how we kind of collapse this information at the fund level. So the first thing you'll see on lives impacted, we do track lives impacted. Our companies report on this on a quarterly basis. You can see some maybe interesting metrics. The split between male and female farmers is a 60-30 split roughly, or 60-40 split roughly. And so far we've impacted 2.9 million lives. Under farmer well-being, you see that this is actually from 2020. No, sorry, it's from 2021. You'll see that 79% of our farmers report increased income. That's very encouraging for us. And then you'll also note that the 62% of the farmers reported that this is the first time that they've accessed a product like this. 77% report an improved way of farming. 81% report increased yields, and 88% report an overall improved quality of life. And we track that on an annual basis. You can see as well on the gender and management, we do try to understand what's happening at the gender level, because we do report and we do provide incentives for our companies to put gender at the forefront of their business model. But finally, you'll see there under climate resilience, you'll see that the resilience, 43% of the farmers in our portfolio have gone through the surveys and they are resilient. If you can see the kind of the gray text under it, like the 43% is not really the headline as far as I'm concerned. I think the real headline is when you see the baseline is 38%, and then in 1 year it's gone up to 43%. this is what it means to track things year over year, so we can see if we're having the success that we want. We can see if our we're being true to our investment thesis, which is to help smallholder farmers become more climate resilient. So I'll leave you with that, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. This was also a very interesting presentation. And I was listening to you and also looking at the slides. And I can see that you're actually using a number of proxies to measure that the farmers have increased their adaptive capacity, such as increased yield or increased income. Uh, yeah. So just one follow-up question before we move to Dr. Sedek. Uh, I often hear the narrative that it's very difficult for a private sector company to measure climate impact, but I can see that you're actually like working in this space and you're doing that. So, what is the secret?
So I think the secret lies in the fact that so inside of Acumen, we piloted something called 60 decibels, which is a data collection platform that is meant to provide quick signal in the noise data back. It is not meant to be an RCT. In the impact space, RCTs are great, but they cost a lot of money and take a lot of time to get results. And so we piloted this service. It was part of our kind of M&E arm of impact of Acumen, and then we spun it out, and so now anybody can work with 60 decibels to do these types of surveys. So we had the DNA inside of us already to do this type of data collection. And so when it was time to apply it to a climate resilience framework, some research had to be done to understand what the right metrics were, but it was really part of our orientation as an organization. And so that's how we've been able to kind of like build momentum around it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. This was a very insightful presentation. And again, I have also a lot of questions for you, but let me ask them later because now I want to move to our next speaker today, Dr. Fazil Rabi Sadek Ahmed from PKSF. And he'll also talk about an example of a project that is supported by the GCF, but also how PKSF, which is a Bangladesh based development agency, how adaptation impact is being measured there. I think that is also a very important perspective because you can see how you can work on impact measurement for adaptation in a national context and through a national development agency. So Dr. Sadiq, the floor is yours, and I would ask for number 2.
Thank you, Vlad, and thank you, the distinguished panelists and respectable audiences. Actually, our organization is PKSF, Polli Karma Sahayak Foundation. It's in Bangla term. In English, we can say that this is the foundation to help the rural poor. This is the meaning. Actually, it is the government-owned company. Its mandate is to help poor and ultra poor by employing them and reduce the poverty. This is the ultimate objective of PKSF. Let me share with you some of our experience to work with climate change adaptation, particularly the project of GCF, Green Climate Fund. In fact, as I said, it's the legally non-profit organization in Bangladesh, and it was established in 1990. Actually, Bangladesh is one of the least developed country. Our poor percentage is around 30%. So in terms of population, our portfolio is big. Actually, the households are around 15 million household, and total population is 40 to 50 million. We have access on that numbers of population. In fact, it is the non-profit organization, but our working modality is to work with the NGOs. We call them partner organization. We are not directly working the field level. We just give them the support, monitoring, technical support, financing, this and that. But every works implemented by the partner organization, that is NGOs. We have around 278 partner organization, and they have around 12,000 branches all over the country. In our country, 64 districts. And as I said earlier, that our total target household is around 150 million, something like that. Actually, we, if we consider our total portfolio of work, we somehow touch 12 goals out of the 17 goals of sustainable development, million development goals. In fact, recently in 2014, we actually established a separate unit. We called them Environment and Climate Unit. The objective of that, as you know, we are one of the vulnerable country due to climate change, and uh, Bangladesh is one of the dense populated country in the world. So environment and climate, both issues are very much relevant for us and very much important as well to uh, to contain our sustainable development, to keep our development sustainable in future. So based on that scenario, although we are working in the poor ultra poor, still in agricultural sector, fisheries, livestock, infrastructure, micro enterprise, we need to address the we need to address the environment and climate change issues properly in terms of size of our population. In fact, we are new, but still we are trying to address the environmental issues. For example, environment compliance of the Bangladesh government, as well as the initial environmental examination, environmental impact assessment, something like that. And we are working with, as I said, the poor ultra poor. Our focus area on climate change is adaptation, but in somehow we tries to address the mitigation issues. For example, improve cook stoves, biogas plants, alternate wet and drying system in agriculture, manure management, this and that. In the smaller case, we try to address the mitigation as well, but our focus is climate change adaptation. In fact, in PKSF actually, as climate change is very much, it is a cross-cutting issue, and it has vulnerability on agriculture, fisheries, livestock, and the poor people, poor shelter as well. So somehow we are actually engaged with climate change adaptation, although uh, previous years we did not mention the climate change adaptation, but we are very much engaged, because in the field level they have vulnerability. We introduce climate change resilient crops, climate resilient household. We have to address that because vulnerable country, flood, drought, again cyclone, storms, or this and that. Officially, actually, we introduced a project that is community climate change project in the year 2016 under a government fund. It is called Bangladesh Climate Change Resilience Fund. Out of that fund, we uh, actually implemented a project, $13 million project. We actually work on around 40 sub district of the country, and main activities of that project actually raise homestead pledge in the flood prone and coastal prone areas, and introducing uh, drinking water to the vulnerable population, and re-excavation pond and climate resilient livelihood in flood prone and saline prone areas, and to support the sanitation as well on that activities. But these activities was mainly based on the resilient shelter. And based on this resilient shelter, we tried to introduce resilient livelihood as well for the poor and ultra poor. And we have other project that projects some components with climate change adaptation. For example, we have rural micro enterprise transformation projects. In that projects, we have some activity on livestock, fisheries, agriculture. We tried to introduce climate resilient fisheries, livestock. For example, in livestock sector, we are providing around 20% livestock population of the country their manure management. As you know, manure actually emit lots of methane. We go to the manure management, production of vermicompost, so that and methane emission can be reduced and we can use the organic fertilizer in the and again poultry management, fisheries management, in kind of in some areas the sweetwater fisheries is endangered due to the salinity intrusion, so introduce saline tolerant fisheries, crab farming, something like that. In that way we tried to adapt our agriculture and other sectors as well as to reduce the greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere. And another project is promoting agricultural commercialization and enterprise, that is some kind of micro enterprises. In that enterprise, we also tried, as I said earlier, that we work with the poor. So, based on the micro enterprise, we tried to introduce climate resilient activities as well as mitigation activities. We have now ongoing another project, Pathways to Prosperity to Extremely Poor People. It is under the funded of the European Union and FCDO, formerly it is DFID. That is also livelihood support for the poor, ultra poor on climate change resilient way. For example, vegetable cultivation in sack, salt, in in salt, water tolerant rice variety, salt tolerant vegetables, something that is resilient agricultural activity, and again some kind of early warning system and rainwater harvesting. As you know, that in the drought prone areas and saline prone areas of the country, and potable water is a constraint, so we try to introduce the, and in coastal areas actually in the drought season, winter. In the drought and the winter season, there is not enough water. Then we introduce actually rainwater harvesting system so that we can keep in storage and can use it in future time. And let's come to the GCF project. Actually, that we accredited to GCF in the year 2017 as direct access entity. Our portfolio, we can go up to the medium category or environmental stage, and we can only handle the small kind of projects. And we are already also accredited with the adaptation fund, and we are accredited in the year 2021. We got a project from the GCF in the year 2019, and we started its activity in 2022. It's 4 years project, and that project is called Extended Community Climate Change Projects, and we are implementing that projects in the field level through our partner NGOs. We call them implementing entity. This project actually this is the project, and before that actually we got another project on readiness support. Actually we have some other accredited direct access entity as well as we have implementing entity in the field level to make them prepared to implement it properly in the field level. We already implemented it. It is very small project, $0.3 million, but extended climate change project, it is around $10 billion from the GCF side and $3 million from the PKSF side. This is actually simplified approval process, SAP project, and the goal of the project, as you see, the goal of the project is to increase the resilience of the poor marginalized and climate vulnerable communities towards the adverse effect of climate change in flood-prone areas. As I said earlier, that we are implementing in 9 districts and 11 sub-districts of uh, 5 districts, 11 sub-districts of climate vulnerable flood-prone areas. The target outcomes of that project is in institutions and community groups strengthen capacity on addressing climate change, particularly flood, protection of homestead from the adverse effect of flood, increased access to safe water and sanitation, and access to flood resilient livelihood. Our actually beneficiaries target household is 20,000 and total beneficiaries 90,000 people. As I said earlier, we are actually implementing it in 5 flood prone northern districts of Bangladesh. And our actually outcome level, if we go through that, actually uh, the approach measuring the impact of adaptation, number one is the institution, that means NGOs, we call them implementing entities, and community groups strengthen capacity on addressing climate change. Actually, in the project profile, and we are in the field level, we are implementing it. We are organizing different training sessions, seminars, workshop for the implementing entity staffs, and we are producing some kind of documents, as for example newsletter, brochure, lessons learned for them, and we already produced the guidelines and manual for the implementing entities so that they can effectively implement the project, and capacity building in the field level through field visit and exchange visit, and then strengthen capacity of the community groups. In that project, our mechanism actually, as it is a small project, it's only $10 million, but vulnerable population is very high. So we produce the community groups, and that they decide who will take the preference to get the support from the project. For example, in an area maybe 20 people supposed to get support in terms of the criteria of the project, but we have the uh, support for only 5 people. The community groups actually decides who will get the benefit, and that actually very good example, and that helps a lot of the project management unit to identify the beneficiary and the project level, as the beneficiary targeted population is higher than the project tries to address. And what they work monthly basis, sometimes by monthly basis, arrange a group meeting, and the number of the groups is around 20 to 25 people, and as PKSF is working, out of that, our 90% beneficiary is women. In this project as well, we although we target the household, but in the group, around 90% population is the women, and as we support the shelter, household, and homestead gardening and some kind of agriculture, so women are mostly relevant to them, and some kind of capacity building training for the CCAG members. CCAG means climate change adaptation groups, and some kind of uh, improving the decision making capability of the women in the field or grassroots level. And we tries to disseminate the knowledge of climate change on a systematic basis. Although they are suffering, they know their vulnerability, but we try to give them the knowledge so that they can address the vulnerability issue by themselves, uh, by by giving the early warning system and early warning information, and some kind of flood forecasting or raining forecasting, something like that is that might be helpful for them. And above all, as I said earlier, we produce some kind of newsletter, brochures for them to, and frequently, by exchange visit or some kind of meeting in the field level, training to them to improve their capacity to address their vulnerability. And in fact, adaptation actually our activities mainly focused on the household basis. Our target is to make the resilient of the shelter of the targeted households. That means it's flood-prone areas, and we make them resilient shelter. That means plain or the height of the household would be above the flood level. That is the main activity of this person. Based on that um, uh, uh, raised raised household, we support them to construct their household and make some kind of homestead gardening and provide them the some kind of homestead activities, goat or sheep, sheep rearing, poultry rearing, as well as some kind of sanitation and water supply in the raised plain, the raised or resilient housing. That means it's kind of complete resilience measures, first shelter, then livelihood and water sanitation as well with that. And we are already in the middle of the project implementation, and up to now we are on track on our log frame and the future planning. And adaptation measures, as I said earlier, uh, we actually provide the sanitation as well. So health, we tries to address the health issues and water supply simultaneously. And access to flood resilient livelihood, as I said, that in the homestead we provide some kind of small kind of activity, homestead gardening, and some kind of livestock, for example, goat, sheep, and poultry. But side by side, we are providing climate resilient agriculture. Those have the land for agriculture, and some mm, beneficiaries do not have the land for agricultural cultivation, or some have. Then we provide them the resilient seeds and resilience cultivation technology. For example, rice, wheat, and other kind of agricultural product in a resilient way. We have some kind of resilient varieties and resilient technology in Bangladesh available through Bangladesh Agricultural Research Institute, Bangladesh Rice Research Institute. We have memorandum of understanding with that institutions. By getting technical support from them, we are providing technical support in the household level of that poor community. And as I said, it is we have the environment, so we try to it, although it is small scale activity, still we try to address the environmental issues. For example, for their irrigation, we provide support, or we encourage them to use the surface water rather than groundwater. As you know, we are using lots of groundwater, and groundwater level is depleting in alarming way, unsustainable way. So in the coming days, we are mostly focused on groundwater, and we provide them support, use the organic agriculture as much as possible rather than a chemical fertilizer or chemical insecticide, pesticide. We are providing, we are encourage them to use integrated pest management system, as well as some kind of waste management. Although they have very limited activity, but still we are providing support to waste for livestock as well as human. So far, it is generated in a climate resilient way, as well as to reduce the greenhouse gas emission in the atmosphere. And as I said earlier, our targeted population is around 90% of them are women. So in that case, the women are getting capable to address their own issues, as well as to take the lead on their livelihood support in the homestead, particular homestead, as well as decision making process. We are facing some kind of problem as well in the field level, actually, and they, although they are facing uh, climate change impacts, but they are understanding how to address the climate change. It was not common for them, so we provide some kind of knowledge almost they are illiterate, but we are providing in their own way, in their own language, to kind of capacity building support for them. And actually we are raising planes actually in the clustered way, few families in a cluster, not individually. If we make it individually, then it is not sustained. In the flood they are actually washed away, but some families are actually isolated. That is another issue, is some kind of social grievance, that my homestead is not included in the cluster. So somehow we try to include them in a cluster, but still there is some problem. There is some cluster, some household is beyond the cluster, is far. So this is another challenging task for us. And unavailability of sand or alluvial sand or some kind of thing. Uh, as I said, Bangladesh is dense populated country, and we are using almost all areas for agriculture. So getting fallow land or unfertile land or some kind of ditch or canal to get extract soil for the plant raising, it is another challenge for us. Sometimes we have to buy the soil, and it is not available in all cases. And one of the criteria for this project was actually the vulnerability and the poverty. So considering vulnerability, maximum of our working area is very remote. So making communication with the remote areas. Sometimes I visit, sometimes go by car, then walk, then boat, and then horse cart. See the how could we? It is the way to reach in our targeted areas. So communication, keep communication with them, particularly flood. When it is flood, then it is sometimes it is difficult, but we tries to address them as much as possible. So thank you very much. It is if you have any question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siddiq. This was also a very detailed and rich presentation, because we saw how one of your projects that addresses a number of climate vulnerabilities is being implemented, and how you're looking at the results there. So my very quick question before I move to Lifeng, and maybe just a 10 seconds answer from you. Isn't it very difficult to collect data on this, because you're working with a lot of communities? So uh, what is your recipe for collecting the right data? Yeah. So what is your recipe? What is the way you're collecting data for all of these interventions?
In fact, we have the project management unit. We have program officer. Actually, we are visiting the areas every quarter of the year. But every 3 months we are visiting one thing. And now we introduce an online system, and almost on weekly basis we are getting the report from the field level. And by mobile phone and online system, actually we get the immediately result from the field level, and then we can introduce. And if there is any kind of problem which we cannot solve, then the field visit we try to solve. Sometimes we get support from the local administration to
I
solve the.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Sadek. So we have two more speakers. So I want to move forward to Li Feng from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And actually, Li Feng, I want to ask you a very quick question, which probably links to the core of the work that FAO is doing. So you're looking at food and agriculture, and also you're looking at forestry. But there, if you talk about agriculture, if you talk about forestry, this is very often seen as areas for mitigation. But these areas, but there are also a lot of adaptation interventions in this sector, as we heard also from some of the previous speakers. So my question to you today is, what is the approach of FAO for measuring adaptation impact in forestry projects and in agricultural projects?
Thank you, Walad. I think I also benefit a lot from the previous two speakers. Already used the example of your works on agriculture, on aquaculture, and on the climate adaptation projects at in this sector. Certainly, the measurement for adaptation, it's not that easy. And compared to the projects that focus on mitigation, which measure the impacts on adaptation interventions, it's much more difficult, much more challenging, because basically we are doing the adaptation project with all the different sectors. We heard the sector in terms of water, the sector in terms of fishery, the sector on other agriculture or or forest, and then the interventions are very different. The result you achieved also very different. So it's hard to come out with one single measurement, apart from how many people directly or indirectly benefit from the interventions, how many people will get much more knowledge, so as to learn and then strengthen their capacity to adapt to the future climate change. Then other benefits, it's really hard to measure. Even look at the from land or forest perspective. Yes, we can talk about number of the hectares of the forest, number of the hectare of the land that's covered by the project. But then when you look at the details, it's also different. The improvement in the forest will be very different in terms of improvement on the other agricultural land or aquaculture, the fish ponds. And to be frank, that's why when we look at the adaptation project, we have to be very smart from the very beginning. What kind of a theory of change you designed, you build into the project? Like mentioned by the first speaker, use the nice framework to be able to measure at the activity level, at output level, at outcome level, even at the impact level, what kinds of activity and what kinds of result are we trying to achieve. So start from the very beginning, have a clearly defined and developed a theory of change. If we're doing this, and hopefully few things going to be changed. That's one point. The other point I want to bring to the discussion is really about the M&E design from the very beginning, and what kind of indicator, how are we going to monitor those indicators and build into that into the project document, which is not easy exercise because we are working at multiple levels, but that's really the key to make sure that the project is designed robust enough and to be able to show the result in the future. I'll give you one example of one of the projects that's funded by GCF in Jordan, which is approved last year. Really look at how we can improve the water management to addressing the climate impacts in the Jordan. Jordan is one of the most water scarce countries. So through the project we designed, look at how we can help the community to improve the wastewater reuse, but also through that, then be able to look at how the water could be reused not only for agriculture, but also for other activities around the community. And certainly, that project will directly benefit about 80,000 people. But then because that project also, through the agriculture activities, also indirectly, potentially benefit about 120,000 people. So you talk about the measurement, certainly depends on the level of the intervention and depends on the different stage of the intervention. Certainly the measurement is also very different. So I just want to share very briefly. Certainly we're facing the conundrum how to make the project robust and then be able to convince the GCF to fund the project, But on the other side, it is not easy to design all this measurement to be able to report on the result in the future. Adaptation project covers all the related sectors, from water resource management to land to fishery to agriculture to early warning, even to some of the infrastructures. So we will need to different measurement in terms of result. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Li Fan. And you touch upon some very important issues, including the need to have a theory of change and also about the challenges we experience in collecting data, which resonates with what was mentioned in the previous presentations. And I think that we saw a lot of common topics on adaptation result management that came through the presentations today. So I want to move now to the last presentation, which is from Laila from Perspectives Climate Group. And she will talk about an approach that Perspectives is currently working on determining the estimating adaptation beneficiaries. And that approach contains a lot of elements of what many of the previous speakers have discussed. There are also a lot of innovative approaches. So I think it will be a very nice way to close this panel. So Leila, over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to present our proposed approach on how to define and assess the GCF core adaptation indicator, the number of direct and indirect beneficiaries. So I will start by outlining the relevance and urgency of having a robust, science-based, summable and meaningful adaptation impact indicator. Next, I would like to speak a bit about the background and objective of our collaboration with the GCF. And this will be followed by a presentation of the key definition and concepts of our methodology. And I will close with some emerging lessons of the ongoing analysis of the GCF adaptation cross-cutting project portfolio. So today is Adaptation Day here at COP27. I think I don't have to repeat why it is imperative to put a bigger focus on adaptation. The recently published Adaptation Gap Report stresses that the adaptation finance gap is likely 5 to 10 times greater than the current global adaptation finance flows, and it continues to widen. It also highlights that inadequate metrics are among the reasons why adaptation actions don't always lead to enhanced climate resilience. Therefore, it is of utmost importance that the already scarce financial means for adaptation support measures that have a clear link to adaptation benefits. Unlike for mitigation, we are not yet able to measure adaptation against the common metrics, making tracking, aggregating and stock taking of adaptation progress challenging, especially for crunch issues during this COP, such as the global stocktake and the global goal on adaptation. The GCF, as the largest international public climate finance provider, can lead the way for other climate funds and serve as a trailblazer in measuring adaptation outcomes in a consistent, comparable and aggregated manner. So the adaptation and the total number of direct and indirect beneficiaries is the only mandatory core adaptation indicator of the GCF so far. However, the lack of guidance on how to assess this indicator led to diverging interpretations and calculations of the indicator. Moreover, the 2021 report of the GCF's independent evaluation unit highlighted 3 main challenges related to this indicator. First, the heterogeneous approaches hinder comparison of projects and aggregation of beneficiaries. Second, it led sometimes to overestimation of beneficiaries, and at times the reporting even exceeded the total population of countries. And lastly, the depth of the adaptation impact per beneficiary cannot be monitored with this indicator. Against this backdrop, the first objective of our project was to develop a robust methodology for the future estimation of the total number of direct and indirect beneficiaries. Secondly, it was our aim to review the estimation of beneficiaries from 133 approve projects in the GCF adaptation and cross-cutting portfolio against this new developed methodology. Based on this analysis, we explored lessons learned that can further improve the adaptation approach of the GCF. So, our methodological approach started with the definition of adaptation beneficiaries, which relies on the adaptation benefit. So that's why we start with that. We define the adaptation benefit as the measurable outcome or impact of an intervention that represents an increase in resilience or reduced vulnerability of a defined target system compared to a baseline scenario. One important temporal aspect of adaptation benefits relates to the generation of the benefit through its results chain, as you can see here and in the lower part of the slide. The adaptation benefit of an intervention can only be observed on the medium to long term. That means on the outcome and impact level of the results chain. An example for an adaptation benefit, for example, is maintained or increased crop production or enhanced water availability compared to the baseline scenario despite worsening climatic conditions. So, based on the adaptation benefit definition, we say that an adaptation intervention can only deliver an adaptation benefit if it takes place in a climate change vulnerability context, if it addresses this vulnerability context, and if it can demonstrate a clear, direct, and coherent link between the adaptation measure and said context. To prevent that a huge number of beneficiaries is reported who receive only a marginal benefit from an intervention, we propose a materiality threshold to be introduced. The materiality threshold defines the minimum benefit that is required to count a person as a beneficiary of an intervention. Materiality of an adaptation benefit is given if the improvement of the relevant indicator exceeds 5%. This is similar as the CDM had in the mitigation sphere. So it has to exceed 5% of the difference between the scenarios without and with climate change. If the improvement in the parameter is lower than 5%, the person cannot be considered a beneficiary. To make an example, to make this better understandable, so in the case of an area facing water scarcity due to climate change, a project focusing on enhancing water availability through, for example, rainwater harvesting, households will be counted if the water available per person is equal or exceeding 5% of the reduction in available water due to climate change. So based on the definition of the adaptation benefit and the criteria of an adaptation intervention, we redefined the existing GCF definition of an adaptation benefit by defining that an adaptation beneficiary is an individual receiving a material and measurable amount of an adaptation benefit from an intervention. The direct beneficiaries receive targeted support in form of money or services and a material amount of the adaptation benefit. Indirect beneficiaries, on the other hand, are not targeted by the intervention, but are likely to receive a material amount of beneficiary adaptation benefit. So the key difference between direct and indirect beneficiaries for us is that the indirect beneficiaries are not targeted by the project. Summed up, the main differences between our approach and the GCF approach is that our definition positions the indicator clearly on the outcome and impact level. Moreover, the materiality threshold prevents overestimation of individuals that only receive insignificant changes in the targeted parameter. As well, we also we ensured permanence and rational behavior is assumed for adaptation beneficiaries in our definition. So I just want to quickly touch upon one of our ideas for further improvement of the indicator, which would address one of the main critiques that I mentioned earlier, namely the lack of consideration of the depth of impact. Our idea would be to apply an impact weighting on the number of material adaptation beneficiaries by multiplying the beneficiaries with an impact factor. This impact factor consists of a contribution and a barrier factor. The first one rates the degree to which an intervention can contribute to the successful achievement of an adaptation benefit. For example, if an intervention plans to introduce an early warning system, the effectiveness of the intervention depends, among other things, on the existence of shelters. So if it's not included in the activity to provide shelters, the contribution factor would be lower. The second component is the barrier factor, which looks at the barriers that can prevent the achievement of the benefit. So, because of the limited time, I'll skip. I can talk more about the impact weighting later if we have time for questions. But to conclude, we have some emerging lessons from the analysis that we did so far. And this is, first of all, robust baseline scenarios are crucial to measure the intended change in the indicator. Secondly, there's a strong need for proper vulnerability analysis and beneficiaries mapping. Thirdly, the climate rationale needs to be clearly described. And lastly, interventions need to account for maladaptation. With that, I would like to close, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laila. And I also want to thank for, first of all, sharing this information with all the participants today, but also for the work that Perspectives have been doing on analyzing the portfolio. So maybe just to add one more thing to what Laila presented in her intervention. So in our new integrated result management handbook, result management framework handbook, we have included a new definition of direct and indirect beneficiaries. So that has been based to a great extent on what Perspectives actually have done, but we made some modifications on our side based on internal discussions and also take into consideration the realities of our portfolio. So for example, on the materiality threshold, Perspectives says they suggested a 5% threshold, but we thought that it's more appropriate to determine a materiality threshold on a case-by-case basis, depending on the type of projects. And because if you have like an early warning system project, whether 5% is appropriate or not is something that we can also get about. But a lot of that framework has been now reflected, and the impact-weighted approach is, of course, something we can consider from now on, but it is not currently included in the result handbook. But as you can see, a lot of the things that Perspectives have included in their report, they also resonate a lot with what we have discussed today. And I wanted to ask some more questions to the panelists, but being aware of the time and the fact that there is going to be another event in 15 minutes, I just want to take 2 questions from the audience and then conclude this panel, and you'll be able to talk to the panelists after that bilaterally. So are there any questions from the audience, our speakers today? Yep. Okay, Paul.
Hi, Paul Mitchell from Save the Children. I actually have questions for all of you, but I'll restrict myself to one. Rebecca, I actually have one question for you, but it has 3 parts, but I think they're really easy to answer. The first one is that the ARIS system, is it open source or proprietary? Is it available for others to use? Part 2, the 76 questions seems like a huge number. So are farmers generally happy to participate and engage in that long of a telephone call? And then 3 was whether you track the same cohorts over time or whether you kind of change through.
So it is open source. So you can contact WinRock or me, and I can put you in touch with WinRock. So it is widely available. 76 is really the maximum number of questions. Farmers are, we ask it once a year. So they are kind enough to complete the survey, which is nice, and they do it anonymously. So I think that also helps them to be free. But yeah, it is a heavy ask. It's usually about 15 minutes. Yeah, sometimes maybe as long as 20 minutes. And then your third question was around same cohort. Yep. So in our first 2 years, we were tracking the same cohort. So the baseline that you see is actually the same set of people between year 1 and year 2, which was great. What we found, though, is that there's a natural attrition. So our data sets get smaller and smaller year over year. So what we've done is that we've asked for a larger data set from the company And what we've done is that we will disaggregate the data based upon new customers and existing customers so that we can still track that cohort, but we have a larger data set to pull from as attrition happens.
Thank you. One more question from the audience. Anyone? Okay, I don't see any hands. So in that case, can I ask each one of you just to give like a 15 to 20 seconds of closing remarks? Maybe I can start with Yusuf here.
I think for me, the most important thing on adaptation that we need to think about when it comes to measuring and results is data and getting it right at the beginning. Otherwise, we're not, and flexibility.
Thank you. Rebecca?
Sure. I think the hardest part about measuring adaptation is that basically it's behavior change, and behavior change takes time. We measure climate resilience on an annual basis. We're thinking about moving it to every other year because the incremental changes will show up, or we're hoping that the incremental changes will show up when you expand the data collection time. But behavior change is hard and it takes time, so that's something something that we struggle with because we want like quick results, but we're in it for the long haul. Our fund is a 10-year fund, and we're only on year 2, so we have time. But that's something to think about when you do start to incorporate different assessment models. Is that the change will not necessarily be overnight or year over year.
Thank you, Dr. Sadiq.
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, adaptation is country specific, local specific. Vulnerability is different from place to place. So in terms of mitigation, it's just reduction of carbon dioxide, methane, like that. But adaptation, it's very difficult. It depends on vulnerability. So this is challenging. But if we, in the beginning of the knowledge lessons learned, if we take proper indicator, then the measurement might be a little bit easier. Thank you.
Thank you. Lifan, please.
I think measurement of adaptation result. I think we need to embrace the diversity, but then we need to be clear about the theory of change.
Thank you. And Laila, the last comment, but not least important.
So effective adaptation needs for me a strong climate rationale, a link between the adaptation measure and the adaptation benefit, and adequate indicators to measure it. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who joined us today. It was a very rich, a little bit technical discussion, but on a very important topic. And I think we had a good platform where we could see what different institutions are doing in relation to adaptation measurement that shows actually what we should do as partners, sit together and discuss different approaches and eventually move towards the same goal, fight against climate change, and measuring the pace at which we are achieving results and how we're achieving results is something very important. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today and want to invite you for a big round of applause for our panelists.